Well, as most of you might already know, the Dutch government has fallen, collapsed. What does that mean? It means that they are now in what is called the demissionary stage, or caretaker government. Tonight I would like to take the opportunity to explain what a caretaker government is now that this has happened. But before I do, I would just like to say that now they are officially a minority government. The Liberals and the Christian Democrats have no more indirect tie with the fascists. The fascist Geert Wilders is no longer indirectly part of the government in this so-called demissionary government or caretaker government, or demissionary cabinet is the correct way to say it. So, the Netherlands is no longer an indirectly fascist state, at least not for the next few months ahead. Which gives me some sense of hope that maybe I could wear the Dutch flag lapel pin with pride once again. I'm wearing the flag lapel pin of Greece at the moment because it's a symbol of democracy. Now, what is a caretaker government or a demissionary cabinet? It is the time in between just before an election when the Prime Minister asks the head of state in a parliamentary system to dissolve Parliament, and then an election is held. And then after the election is held, if there's government formation talks for, let's say, a coalition, or the short period between, if there's a clear majority, until the new MPs are sworn in and the cabinet are sworn in. They all raise their hands and take the oath of office. So in between that time, So that time, before the new government and the new parliament is sworn in, and just after parliament is dissolved and then there's an election, that time is when there is a caretaker government in place, or a demissionary government. Now, what does that exactly mean? It means that there will be no more major decisions made because there is no more legislative body in session. Essentially, it means they cannot make controversial or critical decisions. They can only stick to the policy that has already been made. There will not be any new major decisions until a new parliament and a new government is sworn in. The old government stays in place with the policies that they already implemented. Now, because there's no legislative body to pass laws or pass bills, bits of legislation on mostly controversial things, so the government cannot make any critical decisions or any new decisions. Anyway, so that's the extent of their power. it's like the time between, or in the United States rather, it's the time between when an election is held. The United States is a presidential system, so there's not government formation talks for a parliamentary majority. In a presidential system, there's the government has separation of powers, so the government can immediately be placed in. So a government can immediately be sworn in. So the parliament can immediately be sworn in and the president can immediately be sworn in. There are no coalition talks in a presidential system. So in a presidential system, it's not as long as in a parliamentary system if there is no clear majority. Demissionary cabinets and caretaker governments don't take as long. In the United States, for example, the November election, for example, congressional, November election and January 3rd, when the Congress is sworn in, that's the demissionary Congress. That's the lame duck Congress. Or the November election and then January 20th, the lame duck president. It's called the lame duck stage, so it's essentially, that's their version of a caretaker government or a demissionary government. A demissionary cabinet, rather. I apologize if I repeat myself sometimes. So, in a parliamentary system, it gets more complicated. Because when an election has to be held, the Prime Minister, unless they have fixed term parliaments, Prime Minister can decide whenever to dissolve Parliament, whenever to hold an election, and then after an election is held, when there's no clear majority, talks to form a parliamentary majority, and only after forming the parliamentary majority do they then swear in the cabinet and the new prime minister. That can last a very, very, very long time, as we have seen in Belgium and Iraq. In Belgium, it could take more than a year of a caretaker government. And in the Netherlands, the so-called government collapse, now they're in caretaker mode, the election is due in September, and this is April. And then who knows how long the government formation talks after September will take. So, essentially, I would say that the government has not collapsed. They still have to work with the current sitting parliament, but now they're a minority government. The government in the Netherlands has not collapsed. That's just fancy wording. I don't have a problem with the time when a parliament is dissolved and in an election, or when they have a minority government to an election, because then you have something of an end date. My problem is with when there is a coalition talks to form a parliamentary majority and a government after an election, how long that takes. Because then, let's say a finance minister or a prime minister, they already know they're on their way out. They've lost their election or they've lost many seats. And let's say they want to retire. They want to retire now that they've lost the election. By default, they are still in power because the parliamentary parties take a long, protracted process in forming a parliamentary majority, so the new prime minister and the new cabinet can be sworn in only after the majority is formed. So by default, they are in power for an extended period of time. And this caretaker government can actually still be in place even after the MPs have been sworn in. A prime minister, even though he's not a sitting MP anymore, he's still in power because the parliament cannot decide on a new prime minister, or maybe even a new finance minister, and etc., the cabinet. By default, he stays in power for several more months, maybe even an entire year, even though he is supposed to be on his way out. And then he can propose his caretaker budget or caretaker legislation to the new parliament. Here's where it gets troublesome, because this is anti-democratic, how an old government by default can stay in place for so long before a new government can step in. This is after an election is held. The old government is still in place even though they have been voted out. The old cabinet, the old government is still in place even after they have been voted out. That is anti-democratic. It takes so long for the new, legitimately elected government to step in. Now, this is what supporters of first past the post say. Oh, those extended periods of government talks, instability in government, instability and uncertainty. So we must stick with first past the post. Well, up until the most recent election in Papua New Guinea, they had first past the post. Now they have instant runoff voting. But now they have instant runoff voting in the most recent election. But elections before that, they had first past the post, and they have a lot of government instability. So advocates of first past the post lose time and time again with their arguments. But I'm not here to talk about that voting system. I'm talking about what caretaker governments are, and what demissionary cabinets are. So Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, he said he tendered his resignation. No, he's still Prime Minister until September, and then for a short period after September. But now the fascists are no longer indirectly in government. That makes me happy. For the time being. I don't know if Wilders will enter the next government, whether indirectly or directly. We'll just have to wait and see. Thanks for listening.